almost a quarter of Japan's tourists are Chinese. So there has been some reaction on Twitter, for example, putting China's advisory saying, warning Chinese tourists not to go to Japan, and then, some Japanese saying, well, okay, if you don't want to come, don't come.
It started with what some call an off-the-cuff remark. Others say it was deliberate. Japan's new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi told Parliament that if China were to use force against Taiwan, it could create a survival-threatening situation for Japan. That phrase isn't just rhetoric. Under Japanese law, it's the threshold for military action. Beijing's response? Furious.
China has summoned the Japanese ambassador over comments made by his Prime Minister on Taiwan.
Chinese officials accused Tokyo of crossing a red line and warned of serious consequences. One senior diplomat posted a chilling, violent message online. It was later deleted, but the tone was clear. China has since written to the United Nations, summoned Japan's ambassador, suspended imports of Japanese seafood, issued travel warnings, and cancelled cultural exchanges. Japan, in turn, has advised its citizens in China to stay vigilant. Neither side seems ready to back down. This hostility taps into a deep and bitter history between the two countries, from wartime memories to territorial disputes. But why did a single statement ignite tensions now? And could this latest spat spiral into something far uglier? I'm Mariko Oi in Singapore, and this is the very first episode of Asia Pacific, our brand new podcast from the BBC World Service. Twice a week, we bring you Asia Pacific stories unpacked by those who know them best. And today, I have the BBC's China correspondent Laura Bicker in Beijing and also the BBC's Japan correspondent Shaima Halil in Tokyo. Thank you both. It's so good to have you both on Asia Pacific. Let's start with how we got here. Exactly what did Ms. Takaichi say, Shaima? Because it wasn't like she was making a big speech about Taiwan, was she? She was basically answering a question in Parliament.
Exactly. She wasn't making a big speech, but an opposition lawmaker had mentioned Taiwan. He had a specific question to Ms. Takaichi asking, in regards to Taiwan, what would constitute survival threatening situation? Now, highlight that bit, survival threatening situation, because that's key language. And then the Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, responded with her own very specific language. If there are battleships and the use of force, she said, when it comes to Taiwan, no matter how you think about it, it could constitute a survival threatening situation. That is a legal term in Japanese security law, which essentially means that the armed forces, any armed attack on Japan's allies, on Japan, poses an existentialist threat to Japan, at which point Japan's SDF, self-defense forces, can get involved.
Yeah, I want to ask Laura about Beijing's reaction, but for viewers and listeners wondering why, hypothetically, Taiwan's invasion has anything to do with Japan's survival is, I guess the thinking is, if Taiwan, again, was hypothetically invaded, it could be Okinawa next, because China has spoken about Okinawa/Ryukyu in the past. But Laura, in terms of Beijing's reaction, I mean, we've seen violent protests before. I remember, back in 2012, because my uncle was living in China and there were violent anti-Japan protests. Demonstrators were burning Toyota cars and so on. But this language that this consulate general used, that's quite unprecedented, isn't it?
It is unprecedented in those terms, and I think this is now the most serious diplomatic dispute between Japan and China since that kind of 2010-2012 dispute. It is worth pointing out that those protests on the street came, they were organised protests. In terms of rising anti-Japanese sentiment, this is a year in which China has been commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. What it sees as its victory over Imperial Japan. And all year, there has been this rise in kind of anti-Japanese sentiment. We've seen it on state media. We've seen films commemorating the Nanjing massacre, where 200,000 unarmed civilians were, in the view of Chinese, murdered by Imperial Japanese armies. So I think when it comes to the kind of rhetoric already within China, you've seen a rise of that sentiment. And then, of course, come these comments. Now, we've seen a bit of a return of what outside of China they call the wolf warrior. This kind of aggressive rhetoric that is used by both their politicians and their state media against countries that have allegedly wronged China. And for the last 5 years, the wolf warrior has gone a wee bit silent until now, well and truly back, it would seem. In terms of the kind of aggressive rhetoric, there's been saber rattling from the military. They've said, we've honed our skills through rigorous training. How can we allow you to be so cocky, says the army spokesperson. Former state media commentators have also called Ms. Takaichi a witch. So it has become quite a heated rhetoric over the last week. There was a visit by a Japanese envoy to try to sort things out, to try to ease tensions. But that too didn't seem to go very well. First of all, when it came to the Chinese side, they didn't see the Japanese envoy as being high enough to be sent to sort out such what they see as a huge problem. And second of all, he wore one of the Chinese delegates, a senior diplomat, he wore what is known as a kind of suit. It's a collarless suit with 5 buttons. And it was worn by students in 1919 Chinese students who tried to overcome Japanese imperialism. So it was seen as a sign of defiance on the Chinese side.
I remember watching that meeting, and the Japanese media's reaction was how the Chinese diplomat had his hands both in his pockets, whereas a Japanese official was seen to be bowing. Maybe he was bowing towards the translator. You never know. But, that picture really went viral, and some of the memes were quite, hilarious, to be honest. But at the same time, I want to ask how locals feel about this, because, reading the Japanese public's reaction, when there were those protests in 2012, it was because of a territorial dispute. So I think, people could kind of understand that. Whereas this comment by Ms. Takaichi, I can see a lot of people going, what did she say that's so wrong? Because the language is so specific, and even, not many people in Japan, were aware that what she said was such a big deal, Shaima.
I think from the Japanese side, if you look at the reaction, which I'm sure you've been following, the language that the experts use, the reaction from people on the streets is not as angry as what Laura has been saying on the Chinese side. I think from where I'm sitting, it's more about watching what's going on, waiting for the ramifications, but also asking the question, what was it that was so outrageous? Because again, remember, yes, Tokyo refused to retract, but she did promise to be more careful. In a way, she was saying, look, this. I shouldn't have said it the way I've said it, but this is our stance, right?
Do you think the fact that she's not withdrawing that comment, is it kind of almost benefiting her? Because politically, the in terms of the travel advisory that Beijing gave, one could argue that there were a lot of concerns about over-tourism in Japan, and some people kind of cheering the fact that maybe there are fewer tourists.
There are a couple of things here. I think definitely her standing her ground does serve her well with her domestic audience, with her more conservative constituents, that's for sure. But I also think one of the things that I picked up when I was looking at Twitter reaction is that comment on tourism. Yes, of course, tourism operators are concerned. We've spoken, for example, to a manager of a tea house, a tea ceremony, with many people, with hundreds and hundreds of tourists that are coming. And she said that they've already had cancellations from Chinese tourists. But as you say, Japan has been concerned with over-tourism for the past couple of years. In 2024, it's had record numbers of tourists. And remember, almost a quarter of Japan's tourists are Chinese. So there has been some reaction on Twitter, for example, putting China's advisory saying, warning Chinese tourists not to go to Japan. And then, some Japanese saying, well, okay, if you don't want to come, don't come, that it's fine.
Laura, I want to ask you about that anti-Japan sentiment that you were talking about earlier, because I think you talked about those anti-Japan education, dramas, movies that even young children today continue to watch. I mean, how do locals feel about this latest development? Do they really think that this one comment from Ms. Takaichi is such a huge deal that, that the tensions could actually get so much worse again?
when it comes to people on the ground, I mean, most people here are watching the news, they're seeing state media, they'll just repeat state media lines. But the reason Beijing has acted in this way is it's a carefully calibrated message. This message is not just for Tokyo. This message is for all, perhaps US and its allies, when it comes to this language on Taiwan. This is a message that this issue is a red line that China does not want you to cross. And if you do cross it, there will be consequences. I think there's another bigger point at play here when we talk about Ms. Takaichi. There is a concern, I would imagine, here in Beijing about defence spending. Now, the US is encouraging its allies to spend more on defence. And Beijing may be worried about the militarisation of Asia, of this region, and in particular, Japan, given the history that it has with Japan. And therefore, you know, if you're looking at a Taiwan issue and if you're looking at the new, a month-old Prime Minister of Japan saying that any kind of a theoretical attack on Taiwan, a territory that China believes is its own, any theoretical attack on Taiwan would constitute a military response. They see this as a particular threat. They've even raised it with the United Nations.
Indeed, it's kind of a new Japan under Sanae Takaichi, isn't it? I want to ask you both about where could this go next? Because, you know, Laura, you were talking about anti-Japan sentiment, and yes, you know, there are decades of bitter shared history, especially from the Second World War. But at the same time, you know, one could argue that there's almost like an anti-Japan sentiment that's always there that Beijing could use when, you know, they have domestic issues. You know, it's something that, you know, if they wanted to get rid of anti-Japan sentiment, you know, if they want to improve relations, if they wanted something more out of Tokyo, you know, could they have done something else? So where do you think this could go next? Because we keep seeing these tensions flaring up over and over.
I think the problem now is that perhaps China has said already that unless Ms. Takaichi retracts her comments, there will be further countermeasures. We've yet to see what they may entail. You've already got an urging of tourists not to go. Now, even if you're a young person who's not going on these tour groups, and it has to be mentioned, it's just tour groups really that are being cancelled. Even if you're a young person who's booked a visit to Japan, I mean, we spoke to some young people last week. One of the things they were telling us is one of the reasons why they might think again about going is actually they'd be worried about their parents' reaction, because it's that generation, that older generation, that is worried about Japan and about, you know, what people might think if they go to Japan. So, you know, if you go, you're certainly maybe not. I spoke to a few people that said even if we go, we're not going to put it on our social media. So where does it go from here? I don't think things are going to get better anytime soon.
And I think that this has been a gift to Beijing, almost, Sanae Takaichi's comments, because not only have they used it to warn Japan, to say that this is a red line that Japan shouldn't cross, especially with a prime minister that they're worried about, a kind of a China hawk, someone who's friendly to Taiwan, and also a frequent visitor to the Yasukuni shrine where war criminals are buried. That really angers China. But also, I think it's Tokyo. This is the US's key ally in the region after, you know, a very friendly and rather successful Donald Trump visit to Japan. So I think in a way that has worked well in terms of Beijing framing this as something that a line that shouldn't be crossed. And so in a way, you're kind of in the situation where both sides are pushing, but both sides also know that there are key ties as well. The fact that these are key trading partners. China is Japan's largest trading partner, and we're talking about trillions of yen, billions of dollars coming back and forth. You're talking about auto powerhouses like Nissan, Honda, and Toyota all having big facilities in China. You're talking about trade when it comes to semiconductors and rare earths. All of these are really crucial relationships that both sides will want to maintain.
Yeah, that reminds me, you know, in 2012, when there were those violent protests, and, you know, I actually interviewed my uncle about it. And, you know, he said, yeah, it was a bit scary, but it was actually business as usual behind.
When it comes to business, yeah. Business is business as usual, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting. You said Sanae Takaichi's comments may have been a gift to Beijing, but also the fact that, the US and others have kind of expressed support for Japan in light of all these,
Yes.
reaction from Beijing. And I was looking at this survey where almost half, I think it was like 45% of the Japanese public now support the use of self-defense force to, if there was an invasion of Taiwan, which I thought was quite astonishing because, the LDP, the ruling party, has been trying to, boost defense spending, possibly even change that pacifist constitution. And the public were always reluctant.
Yeah, it was always, the public was always resistant. The public was always wary of hiking up defense spending because it meant that it was veering away from its pacifist constitution. But I think the Japanese public is very aware of the fact that this is a very different neighborhood right now. This is a much more hostile Asia Pacific. It is a much more unstable Asia Pacific. And Japan needs to be able to defend itself. Japan needs to be able to deploy its self-defense forces in an effective way. And so with Sanae Takaichi making these comments, again standing her ground, I think that has polled well with a lot of people here. And as you say, because of what China did, because of China's reaction, that has instantly then brought more support from the United States to Japan.
I think when it comes to what could constitute making it worse, I think when I spoke to some analysts, the thing that would make it a lot worse would be if China once again banned exports of rare earths to Japan. Now, the reason why many people think that might not happen is because obviously it might influence the deal that they already have on the table with the United States. But in terms of being a gift to Beijing, I think also there are issues for Beijing in this. It had put away its wolf warrior teeth for the last 5 years. President Xi has been trying to appeal to other countries as China looks like the new emerging global leader. And then I think it's this comment from the US ambassador to Tokyo. He said, the mask has slipped. It's time for Beijing to behave like the good neighbor it talks repeatedly about being, but fails repeatedly to become. And I think when it comes to that comment, that might touch a little bit of a nerve for other countries who are watching this.
Laura, just a quick question on that. Do you actually think, because I know that you were there covering APEC in South Korea, and again there were these optics of Xi Jinping being, assuming this leadership position in the region, which was quite something to watch. Do you think that this week or these past couple of weeks, China stands towards Japan? Do you think that it might scare people off?
I'm not sure it'll scare people off. It'll certainly, I think it's a reminder of who you're dealing with. That China has its moments and its red lines, and Taiwan for them is a red line, and it's a reminder also to the world of China's ambitions. China has certainly President Xi has vowed to reunite China with Taiwan, the self-governing island, and by force if necessary. And it's a reminder of that. Whether or not there are more countermeasures, whether or not China is going to sit there and go, right, okay, you have to retract these comments, or we are going to take more countermeasures, or whether or not it simmers away and then just levels off, we'll have to see. But it may also depend on what Ms. Takaichi does. If she visits,
I was just going to say,
if she visits,
the
shrine, then I think that would provoke a huge response here in China. And I think that will be the moment where it would be very difficult for these two countries to walk back from this diplomatic spat. I think right now it's a row, it's a spat. I think if she visits the shrine, it becomes something huge.
And it becomes something concrete as well, doesn't it? Because then it says, because up until now, she could say, look, I've answered a question. This was a question in Parliament. I'm the Prime Minister. I'm looking at Japanese law, Japanese defense law, and I answered, in a fully transparent way. Maybe I shouldn't have said what I said the way I said it. I'm not going to retract it, but I'll be careful next time. But if she visits the Yasukuni Shrine, something that China has been dead against and something that China has raised with Japan when the late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe did visit all those years back when he was still in power, her mentor, of course. If she does that, I think that is a more conscious move, knowing that this would anger Beijing. I would be very surprised if she does that.
She's been quite
even though
careful, hasn't she? She hasn't really committed
Yeah.
one way or the other because she doesn't want to upset her supporters by ruling it out either. A very tricky situation that we'll continue to watch what happens next. Thank you so much, Laura Bicker in Beijing and Shaima Halil in Tokyo. You've been watching Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service with me, Mariko Oi, in Singapore. If you have any questions or thoughts on what we covered in this episode or any other stories from this region, please leave us a comment below and click like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. But for now, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.